Introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Claire Marashevsky, and I'm a sophomore at Greenwich Academy. And I focused on Charles. Charles was not only mentioned once late in his Charles was only mentioned once in his late owner David Bush's probate inventory. Beyond that, his entire life is up to interpretation. Charles lived in the Bush Hawley house under the ownership of David and Sarah Scudder Isaacs Bush of Greenwich. In 1790, there was 8 enslaved people living in the Bush Hawley house, 2 being Charles and another enslaved man around the same age of the name Cole. The gradual emancipation of 1784 stated that all enslaved children born after March 1st, 1784 would be freed once they reached the age of 25. The law of prevent slave trade in 1788 goes hand in hand with gradual emancipation. The law required all slave owners to officially list all enslaved people born after March 1st, 1784. In the Commonplace Book 3, page 40, David Bush's list was compiled sometime after 1808. It is safe to assume that Charles was born before 1784, as he nor Cull are mentioned, but Cull's son, Cull Jr., was listed. The census of 1790 under David Bush showed 8 enslaved people living in the Bush Hawley house. According to the Greenwich Historical Society, Charles, Cull, Jupiter, Patience, Candace, Peggy, Phillis, and one undefined enslaved person, most likely to be a woman named Dorcas, were living at the homestead. Bush's will and testament and probate inventory mentioned 7 out of his 10 known enslaved people at the time. In his probate inventory, Charles is listed for the first and only time for $120. In the United States Census for 1800, David Bush had passed away, but Sarah was living in the Bush Hawley house being served by Patience, Cull, and Candace. Cull and Patience were born before 1784, and Candace at the time was still under the age of 25. When with them, one other unknown slave lived at the homestead. According to the Greenwich Historical Society, it is rumored to either be Charles, Jupiter, or Peggy. The bits and pieces of information allowed for Charles' life to be pieced together. At this point, it is assumed that Charles is still working as a slave for the Bush family. There is a surfacing of a man that was mentioned in the United States Census for 1810 and 1820. Originally, he is recorded as Charles Negro in the 1810 census, but 10 years later, he goes by Charles Moore. It is thought to be Charles. It is thought that Charles was potentially emancipated and chose a name representing a new life for himself. Charles Moore was listed as living with 5 other people, 2 being enslaved. Being as Charles was theoretically gained his freedom, it is hard to assume that he lived with 2 enslaved people of his own. The Greenwich Historical Society presents the idea that it is possible that those were enslaved in the household, but lived in the household as free people. Although there is a chance this is correct, why would they not want to get papers of their own? Another vantage point of Charles's life is through Cull. Cull was around the same age as Charles and served the Bush Hawley house at around the same time as him. Although for his early years as an enslaved man, he lived a very similar life to Charles, he gained his freedom under the ownership of Sarah Bush following the death of David. Additionally, the United States Census for 1830 only lists 4 enslaved people still living at the Bush Hawley house: Patience, Cull Jr., Candace, and Candace's son. Charles was never mentioned again after 1808, and it is safe to assume that Charles died after David Bush's probate inventory was published and before the next recorded census, or he was sold outside of Greenwich. Thank you.
Wonderful. And now we have our last student speaker, Leo.
Hello everyone. I am a sophomore at Brunswick School, and although I am not a GA student, I take my U.S. History class with Mr. Walker, and I'm very appreciative to be here and speaking about the story of Charles today. Charles, a lost soul. The year is 1776. Unify as one and fight for your freedom. The new land is the land of opportunity, and America will become the place of great life. How could that be? Families are in distress, and innocent people are willingly running through the lands of death just to get up north. That is because the Unity was segregated. White Americans exhilarated in the joys of becoming independent, while Black Americans in English became more dependent than ever before. The common Black person in America during the late 1700s was forced into slavery. With little to no independence in their lives, and their stories dictated completely by their white proprietors, slaves had no ability to make their mark in American history. That is why this man named Charles is an alien, just a name sitting on a piece of parchment unknown to society today. Yet he represents so much more. His forgotten past portrays the struggles Black Americans faced during this time in history and how they had to struggle through life just to make themselves feel as though they were even living one. However, in this article, the life of Charles will be revealed, all the obstacles he likely faced in the white man's world, and finally his story will be told. A cardinal factor to this story is knowing how prominent racial tensions were at the time and how that led to the creation of the gradual emancipation laws. Slaves were outraged by their status, which can be seen through slave rebellions such as Gabriel's Rebellion or Nat Turner's Rebellion, where groups of slaves directly fought back or stood up to their oppression. People in the North started to gain some sympathy, but it would not come until 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, when northern and southern states were divided into free states and slave states at the 36th parallel. However, this man named Charles, his story was lost in between the years of 1777 and 1820. So the Missouri Compromise that comes later in 1820 has little effect on revealing Charles's life, but it does provide an example for how documentation of slaves may have easily been lost due to the sudden changes in society those types of laws create. Now, a piece of legislation that was passed during the years of Charles's life becoming a mystery was the Gradual Emancipation Act passed on March 1st, 1784. This article stated that all enslaved individuals born after the passing of this law, March 1st, 1784, will be freed from their enslavement when they turn 25 years old. There is no documentation of Charles's birth date. However, there are records of his name written down in 1788 on David Bush's probate will. The name appears as Negro Man Charles. Also on that probate will is another enslaved man named Cole, whose owner was also David Bush. It is estimated that both Cole and Charles were the same age. Now, let us establish what we know. Firstly, Charles's birthday is unclear, but he must have been born before the year 1788, as his name is written down on his owner's will. Secondly, the Gradual Emancipation Laws passed in 1784. So if he was 4 years old or younger when he was documented in that will, he might possibly have been applicable to the new laws set in place granting him freedom at age 25. Lastly, though, another enslaved man named Cole, who lived in the Bush Holly house and appeared on David Bush's probate will as well, appeared and documented in 1788, but did not appear on Sarah Bush's, David Bush's wife, listed in 1807 of freed slaves relating to the emancipation laws. The grand puzzle to all of this is that in 1803, Sarah Bush wrote the Emancipation for Cole, freeing him from his services as a slave. It can be thought that the only reason why she would do that is because Cole did not qualify for the Gradual Emancipation Laws, and Miss Bush did not want to keep him enslaved, so she freed him. However, this was 3 years after Charles disappeared from any records, and there was no emancipation written for Charles, and there was no documentation of him being freed by the Gradual Emancipation Laws. So if Cole and Charles were the same age, that means if Cole had to be freed by a written statement from his owner and not from the 1784 law, it most likely means that would be the same case for Charles. Yet no statement of freedom was ever written for him. So what happened to Charles? It is possible he was sent to be enslaved somewhere else. Maybe he ran away and went undocumented for many years, or perhaps he changed his name frequently as he popped up in 1810 census as Charles Moore with 2 O's, but then again in 1820 as in a census as Charles Moore with 1. Furthermore, the exact story of this man named Charles may never be uncovered, but as long as relevant information exists, we shall try to keep filling in the vacant holes of American history. In total, a relevant example of stories familiar to Charles was a woman named Araminta Ross. The name Araminta Ross most likely does not ring a bell in your mind. However, the name Harriet Tubman may sound familiar to some, as she was a pioneer in the fight for civil freedoms for Black Americans. It may come as a surprise that Araminta Ross and Harriet Tubman are the same person. It is reason that she changed her name in the late 1840s due to her being a large bounty to the southern white folks who wanted to stop her process in helping enslaved people in the South escape north above the 36th parallel through the use of her Underground Railroad. This is just an example of how documentation of enslaved people can quite easily get mixed up and turned around. So in the case of Charles, or Charles Moore, or maybe even Charles Moore, he is just one of the hundreds, if not thousands, of stories that remain untold. Yet that is why we tell it now, so that line by line, page by page, the book of American history will continue to turn, until one day every story has been shared.
Beautiful. Can we get one last round of applause for all of our great student speakers? Wonderful. It's not easy speaking in front of others, and you guys did a fantastic job. Thank you for sharing with us the stories of Phillis, Milley, Rose, and Charles. Before we go outside to place the stones, I would like to have a moment of silence. Thank you for being here and sharing in these memories. Now we're going to go outside to place the stones. I have some staff by the door. They will guide you to by the shed where the stones will be placed.